As our journey through Lent inches closer to its end, we come to the story of what was perhaps Jesus' greatest miracle, at least as John tells the story. Right? He's not trifling anymore with water and wine, how the story started. Right? Not even restoring sight to a man born blind, or even feeding 4,000 or 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. As impressive as those miracles were, this one is probably his greatest. In this one story, the death and the raising of Lazarus, we have a story that comes as close to both Good Friday and Easter as we'll get until we actually get to Good Friday and Easter, which is probably why the story is here. The last story in Lent before we come to Holy Week. Because here in this story we get a glimpse, a small snapshot, if you will, of where we're going, of what's coming, both Good Friday and Easter Sunday. And so now as we come as close to the Good Friday experience as we've been this year, we are forced by this story to look death right in the eye, or really to be more in line with the story, to smell death right in our nose, the death of Lazarus. Let me recap the story for you that we just heard. Jesus was told he was away, and he was told that his friend Lazarus was sick, probably sick unto death, but Jesus waited. As the King James says, he tarried. He waited on purpose before coming to Lazarus. And then Lazarus died. Only then Jesus sets out to go to him in Bethany, near Jerusalem. Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, each come out in their grief to meet Jesus, and they both kind of admonish him. If you had been here, right? Jesus finally says, take me to him. And when they reach Lazarus' tomb, Jesus says, roll away the stone, right? The tomb was a cave with a big rock, a big stone blocking the way in. And he says, roll away the stone, and it's here, just here. The dead man's sister objects. She says, Lord, already there is a stench because he's been dead for 4 days. Did you catch that line in that long story? Lord, already there's a stench. I prefer, and I think I've shared this with some of you before, I prefer the King James version of this one verse, because the King James is much more succinct. It gets right to the point. Martha says, Lord, he stinketh. And so it is, even though in this story we never look death in the eye, even when Lazarus is raised, he comes out, his head and face is covered, but we catch the scent of death in our nose. And we all probably are familiar with it. As you know, I used to have a farm and raise livestock. And when you do that, death is around from time to time. And you can get kind of used to it, but you never forget that smell. Just a few days ago, when my wife and I were doing some yard work, we smelled that something was dead somewhere before we saw it, and then found a dead squirrel. And that olfactory memory is right there. It took me right back to the farm. If you have had a whiff of death, it's a smell you will never forget. So Martha said, Lord, already there is a stench. But the story doesn't stop there. It can't stop there, because this isn't a story about death. It's a story about life, a story, a pre-Easter preview of resurrection. Yes, Lazarus has died. He's 4 days dead, right? He gets to be dead longer than Jesus gets to be dead. But he won't stay dead. Jesus utters those 3 powerful words, Lazarus, come forth. And by the sound of Jesus' voice, everything changes, not just for Lazarus, but for his friends and family, for his community, for us, 2,000 years later. This is not simply a story to be taken literally, though I do happen to believe that it happened in history, just as we read it. But it can't just be about what happened 2,000 years ago if it's to be important to us today. To have its full power, we have to understand the deeper meaning of this story. Because we all live parts of our lives in death. Not usually actual physical death, from time to time perhaps, but I mean the everyday death of life and heart and love that comes by the choices that we make. Choices to live in hatred or violence or revenge or fear or disdain. What I mean to say is that there are more ways to kill a heart than to simply stop it from physically beating. When we hate, a piece of our heart dies. We die a small death. When we hoard while others starve, a little piece of our heart dies, and we die a kind of death. When we judge other people while hoping not to be judged ourselves, we die a kind of death. And so the list goes. When we exclude, when we seek revenge, when we turn a blind eye to injustice, when we don't care about the suffering of others, at least not enough to do something about it, we die a small death. When we walk by and let people live in loneliness, when we choose lives of sin and selfishness, our hearts die a little bit with every one of those choices. And with each small death in our hearts, they begin to have a stench, as all death does. And we bury our hearts in cold caves of stone and wrap them up in the clothing of death. See, this story of the raising of Lazarus is not only about what Jesus did for Lazarus, it's not only about something that happened 2,000 years ago in the death and resurrection of one man's body. This is a story about the death of the soul, the death that we choose for ourselves on a daily basis when we decide not to walk in the life and the love and the light of Christ, when we choose not to love, when we choose not to forgive, not to embrace, and not to welcome, not to help. Each one of those times we choose for ourselves a small, cold, dark, damp tomb. And then we have the audacity to lie to ourselves and describe it as comfort. It's the reason why we're dealing with this during Lent, when we're all supposed to be doing the work of self-examination of our lives and shining light in the dark corners and naming the tombs that we willingly walk into by the choices that we make. But remember, this is not a story about death. It can't stop there unless we let it stop there. The story continues. We have to be willing to follow it, to find the good news, which is found in, I think, the three sentences of Jesus near the end of the reading. The first is his command to roll away the stone which blocks that tomb. He says to us in our lives, roll away the stone. And we protest as Martha did. Lord, with me, there's already a stench. I'm too long dead. You can't help me. And Jesus' response is always, don't be afraid. He knows better than any that it is precisely in the stench-filled places in our lives that resurrection is supposed to happen. He anticipates our objection. Lord, already there's a stench. He still says it, roll away the stone. You cannot come out until you roll away the stone. That's the first sentence. The second is like it. Come forth, which is Jesus' call to each and every one of us to come out of our self-chosen tombs, to wake up, to get up, and to move back out into the light, to take a breath of the Spirit of God. It's a call that he gives to each and every one of us every day. And we have a choice to stand up and to move towards the light or to stay where we are, though the stone has been rolled away. And finally, he says, unbind him and let him go. I love this part the best, I think, because it's the in-between, and it's the invitation to participation on behalf of the community. After Lazarus has been raised, this is an easy part to miss, right? Jesus has already picked Lazarus up with his voice, and Lazarus moves. If you've ever seen a Hollywood depiction of this, he looks kind of like a mummy coming out into the light, but he's still covered with all of his burial clothes. He's raised, but he's not fully restored to the living yet. He hasn't rejoined the land of the living. Before he can see fully again the brightness of Christ, before he can breathe fully again the breath of God, his community has to unwrap him. That's the in-between moment when Christ invites us all back into miraculous partnership with him, to do our part to help restore our sisters and brothers to the fullness of life. The resurrection is the miracle that can only be brought by Jesus. But by his invitation, it can only be completed by the community of faith. Only when the community accepts Jesus' invitation to participate in the miracle of resurrection. The reality of resurrection has happened for Lazarus, but he's still bound up in his burial clothes, tangled and struggling, can't see, can't breathe, trying to get them off, and he needs our help. Jesus calls each of us from our various tombs, and we take our first few tentative steps forward towards renewal, but we are, until we are unbound of our burial clothes by the help of our sisters and brothers in Christ, we're not yet free to take in the fullness of the resurrection. He says, unbind him and let him go. Resurrection from our self-imposed tombs is something that we all need, not just in Lent, but especially in Lent. Something that Christ offers to each and every one of us every day. That's when I need resurrection in my life. When I'm sitting in my tomb is every day. I need to hear him say to me every day, roll away the stone, despite my objections. I need to hear him say to me every day, come forth. And I need to hear him invite the community to unbind me, as we all do. Resurrection takes community. People want new life, but they're bound up in their burial clothes, tangled in the rotten strips of death. Old things that stink. Old hatreds, old grudges, old fears, old ways of thinking, old ways of being. It is for us to unbind our neighbors, that they may see the full light of Christ and breathe in the full breath of God. The questions for us today, there are two, I think. What binds you unto death? And will you let yourself hear his call to come forth? Second, who in your life is experiencing the beginnings of resurrection, yet is still tangled up in their burial clothes, unable to fully see, unable to fully move or breathe? Who needs your help in being unbound? Roll away the stone, come forth, and unbind each other. Amen.